Today we're going over this PowerPoint that I told you was we were going to go over today, so let's pay attention and let's hopefully get through this quickly. When we're talking about Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium, we're talking about evolution. And evolution, and this is key that you understand this, evolution is the change in allele frequencies in a population, right? So we're not talking about individuals. Individuals do not evolve. That will be on the test. As always, I'm telling you what's going to be on the test. Individuals do not evolve. It's populations that evolve. You'll notice that whenever you see evolution in this PowerPoint, they're constantly telling you the population is evolving, how the population evolves. So if we're talking about, for instance, allele A, this individual in this population has allele A, what you'll see is that the frequency of that allele A, how many of those alleles are in this giant population, is the frequency. How many of those alleles are in that population is the frequency of that allele. Now, if you don't know what an allele is, you got problems, but everyone in the room does at this point. Well, if you don't, then you're behind. You should see me after school today because I think we've hit it pretty hard. All right. Populations evolve, not individuals. Evolution is a change in gene frequency. So this is why evolution indeed is measurable and it's a fact. How is it that it's a fact? Because evolution is a concept, happens. We can measure it. We could take samples of their blood in all these individuals and we can see what frequency we find allele big capital A. We can come back in 10 years and that frequency, maybe there's less capital A's or maybe there's more capital A's, and we can measure it. We can quantify it. So it's not some abstract concept. It's not something that lacks evidence. Evolution is indeed something that we can measure. So one example of gene frequencies changing is this idea of Genghis Khan. You've all learned about him in history. Genghis Khan was a Mongol. He conquered the known world at the time, by known to Europeans, right? So he conquered most of Asia, China. He's a great conqueror, right? A barbarian. And the tradition at the time was he conquered. They killed, they pillaged, and they raped. And because he raped, and of course had a lot of wives, he had a lot of babies, right? A lot. It's estimated, and this is at least one number from one source, it's estimated about 12% of the human beings alive today have his genes. They're descendants of Genghis Khan. So he changed the allele frequency of our population. He changed the human population's gene frequency. So that's pretty interesting. That was an example of 1,000 years ago where someone could change us as humans. Now, when we're talking about Hardy-Weinberg, understand Hardy-Weinberg says, what do you need to see if you say that a population is not evolving? Right? We're trying to disprove the negative, right? And remember, in science, we don't prove anything, we disprove. So in the Hardy-Weinberg, we're saying the null hypothesis. We call it the null hypothesis. The null hypothesis is this: any time you have a hypothesis, this is not happening. So we try to prove that something's not happening. That's easier to prove than proving it is happening. Does that make sense? Yeah. So the Hardy and Weinberg, they were two scientists from the 1920s. They came together and said, let's look at what you need to have if evolution is not happening. That's their equation. That's what their equation means. Are we clear on that? Because that's another testable item. What you need to know to see if a population is not evolving? Let's look at them. Again, if people would have read this, they'd know. So your homework again was to read this PowerPoint. So here's Hardy-Weinberg. Here are the 5 things you need to have if evolution is not happening. So when evolution is not happening, these 5 things are happening. These 5 things are true. Do you have everyone has their handouts out? Let me say this quickly about, because I sent you that email yesterday about notebooks. Let's be clear. In your notebook, what I would expect if I collected your notebook, let's say next week, what I would expect is you'd have this hole punched. The staple would have been removed. You would have the dates on it. So right now you would have read it. You said date for yesterday. What would you have said? You probably would have read the PowerPoint, read the case study. That's what you did yesterday. Maybe there's some highlights all in the PowerPoint as evidence that you read it. Maybe there's some summary. Maybe there's some questions you want to ask today, right? So that's what I would expect, that last night you were given this reading, you would have read it, maybe wrote down some questions. And then today, as we're going through this, we've already been through 3 of the slides. We're on the 3rd slide now. You would have written some of the things that I've wrote down on the board or repeated several times, that I've repeated several times verbally, right? You'd have that written down. I would not expect that on a day like today, even though you have a handout, that I would have someone turning in this handout on this part of their notebook without any writing on it, or with 1 sentence of writing. I know how much I tell you every day, and I see how little some of you are putting in your notebook, which tells me what? That you're not doing your work when you're in your seats in class. So what does that say? What is that? Does that explain why some of you are getting bad grades? Yes, I would say so. So when I look in the audience, I see one student with an earbud in her ear, and I know that I've seen her notebook, and I know it's not as complete as some others. What would be my conclusion? It's not paying attention. All right. So let's go ahead and take a, here's a copy of it. Did anybody else not get a copy, not have their copy? All right. So by the way, I emailed those to you as well. All right, so Hardy-Weinberg has these five genotypic frequencies, right? Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium describes 5 things that say, okay, if evolution is not happening, these 5 things need to be there. Now notice I didn't write that down, did I? So you should maybe write it down, because that gives you some more meaning as to what these 5 things are. So I'm just, again, trying to emphasize what should be in a notebook, right? So you have this slide. It's already written for you. So what you should do is make sure you say, these 5 things have to be met if things are not evolving, right? And it's basically written here for you, but a little added notation here would help you understand when you go back to study. Yes, question? What? Good question. Excellent question. So yeah, all 5 things have to be true if evolution is not happening, right? Now, could you have a couple, maybe one of the 5 happening in a slow amount? But what would we say? Evolution is probably happening, but a slower, right? So, but really, when you're looking at these 5 things, evolution can also happen faster or slower. And sometimes evolution happens slowly. So the speed of evolution changes depending on the situation. And we'll understand more as we go through the mechanisms of evolution. Yeah. Well, let's talk about that. Let's talk about random. We'll see. With each of these, if you look at the slides after this, each of these is going to have its own slide, and it explains exactly what we're talking about, okay? But right now what we're talking about is something that may be a little abstract, okay? But as we move through the PowerPoint, it gets more concrete. All right, so let's talk first with, yes, question? Depending on the situation, right? So I'm going to just do a quick analogy, and then we'll move on. And I think you'll see more as we go along. This is not something you're going to understand right away. It's going to take several lessons. It's going to take some teasing out, some practice, okay? But let's say we have a population of penguins, these emperor penguins, right? You see them here. And let's say that this guy, that there's this allele in this population. Let's say there's this allele, big A, okay? And there's a few of these guys that have this big A allele. But there's only a few of them. Maybe there's 2% of the population has a big A allele. Everybody else has little a, little a. Or, yeah, little a, little a. Okay, nobody else has this, just a few. This is 2%. What if so slowly, let me talk about first slowly. Let's think about slowly. How would that change slowly? Well, what if, you know what, it's hard to discuss this without first going through these 5 things. So just know that it can go quickly or it can happen slowly. Slowly would be big A is favored, and over many, many generations you see more and more big A happening. That would be slow. Fast would be there's a giant earthquake, and only the ones that, or there's a disease that comes through and kills everybody that doesn't have a big A. So what did you just do? You changed the frequency of alleles. That's evolution. That's it. You've just evolved the population. The population now just has, instead of 2%, now you have 100% of the population's big A. Boom, evolution just happened. So could that happen to humans? Sure. In the 1920s, 30s, 40s, 1945, around 1930s and 40s, there was a Spanish flu. Wiped out close to a third of the population of the planet. Human population. Did that change the allele frequency of the planet? Likely it did. But, we don't know how. But the point is, if you got a disease that comes in and kills everybody that doesn't have this one allele, then what do you got left in the population? The people with that allele. So now we've evolved the population. So that's evolution. That's the definition of evolution. When you start to hear arguments about people arguing back and forth about is evolution real or not, they're arguing about other things that are beyond the scope of this class, okay? In this class, evolution is just simply a change in frequency of the alleles. There are consequences of that, and we'll see. And there's plenty of evidence of this happening as well. So I'm not saying this as if there's no, as if I want you to believe in me. Because what did I say about science? What do? We disprove. We don't believe in anything. We're constantly trying to disprove. Yeah, question in the back? All right, so let's take a look at these 5 things. And you'll understand better at the end of this, and you'll understand even better after tomorrow. And as soon as we do some interactive labs, you'll understand even better, okay? So one way we can have, we need to have, if you're not going to have any evolution, not going to have a change in gene frequency, you have to have a very large population with very little genetic drift. Now, to understand that, and you'll see in a slide in a minute some more of that genetic drift business. You have to understand that, let's say you have this population of creatures, and these creatures obviously have a different set of alleles than the red creatures, right? They're all one species. But you have the red ones have a certain set of alleles, and the black ones have another set of alleles, right? So something happens, some random event, a big tidal wave. Maybe these guys tend to live, for whatever reason, randomly choose to live near the ocean. And maybe these guys randomly choose to live in the mountains, right? There might be a couple, maybe there's a red one over here somewhere, decide to build a house here. Maybe there's one that lives here, all right? So you have this population, let's say of we can look at the population of red or black, but this is the population of red, okay? Is right here, okay? This is time. Something happens. A tsunami comes in and wipes out the entire coast. So only the people on the hill live, right? So these all are gone. What happened to the population? It decreased. Of red, decreased tremendously. I can't use that word anymore. But anyways, came down here. Now we're at this level, aren't we? So the frequency of red went down. Frequency of red in the population just dropped. Why did it drop? It was what? It was wiped out, but it was random, right? So we call this bottlenecking. Gosh, I can't, I hope it's this. Is there a K in necking? No. I always confuse it. I think it's spelled N-E-C-K. I think that's right. All right, so anyways, necking, bottlenecking. So it's a neck, it's a bottleneck. So what it's like this. It's like you have a big population, right? Like in a bottle, and you have an opening. This part, if you have a big population here, you have a much smaller population there, right? This was the event. This was the tsunami. This was the earthquake. This was the volcano. They got rid of a large chunk of the population. Only these guys survived here, right? Maybe there's one red, where here you have mostly red, right? So that's why we call it bottlenecking. And I don't want to delete the whole thing, so I'll just make it smaller. So that would be what we call genetic drift. Just a random events that change the gene frequency. That there was no advantage to having a red being red or black, right? There was no advantage. It just happened that by by some random choice, the reds were on the coast, the blacks were in the hills, and then there were some reds in the hills, but mostly on the coast. And here comes the tsunami, wipes out all the reds, and now you have mostly what in that population? Black, and there's some red. So you just changed the gene frequency. You just saw it decrease, came down, bottlenecked. You see the shape of this? Isn't it very similar to this, right? All right, so bottlenecking comes down. So what you get is a drop in the population, right? But because of some random event. So that is bottlenecking. So genetic drift, the reason we call it drift is that what happens when you're drifting? Do you have a direction? Is there something that's pointing? Do you have a motor that's pushing you through? No. It's just randomly, you kind of, the wave comes and pushes me to the left, the wave comes and... So the change in gene frequencies that happen because of random movements or changes in the environment, like a tsunami, like an earthquake, right? Because random, that wipes out a whole population or portion of the population, and then you get a gene change, a frequency in the change in the frequency of the genes. We call that genetic drift. Are we clear on that? And so, to be clear, that's what we're talking. So you can't have genetic drift if you're going to have have a situation where you don't have evolution. Does that make sense? Because if that happens, if you do get a change in gene frequency because of a random event, then you have evolution. So the only way not to have is that you don't have genetic drift, right? Does that make sense? You don't have what? Bottlenecking is what happens when you do get genetic drift. Does that make sense? You have a drop in that population because of that event. Yeah.
Okay, so you know how we influence certain things to happen, like with pollution and stuff like that?
That's a really great question. Hold on to that question. Write that question down, because I do want to talk about that. That's a change in the environment.
So that wouldn't be a part of
It might be, but let's move on. It could be inadvertent. Actually, there's a really good example of that just happened. I just read an article just yesterday. But let's move on and talk about these other 5 because we're going to run out of time. So the next is this idea of gene flow. Gene flow. And we're going to go through this in a minute, but gene flow happens because of emigration and immigration. Now you should know immigration means in, right? People coming in or individuals coming into the population. Emigration means out. And again, there's some really good diagrams in the following slides, but let's take a look quickly. If you had a population, right? Emigration means out. See how I put out right under M, right? So if you have a population of these yellow squares and then you get immigration, that's you're adding in some reds that come into your population, right? What happens is that the reason you're in that we call that gene flow is that individual's going to come in the population. What are they going to do? They're going to make babies. And those babies now are part of that population. Their genes are part of the gene pool. So now you've changed the gene frequency because of immigration. Now, what if the opposite happens, right? What if you have all these yellows here and you have a couple reds, and you have more yellows and reds, and then all of a sudden, so that's one out of 5, right? 1 out of 5 reds. What happens if you have emigration? One of the yellows leave. So now what do you have? 1 out of what? 1 out of 4. So you've just changed the gene frequency because you had someone leave. So if someone leaves a population or someone comes in, you're changing the gene frequency. So you can't have immigration or emigration if you're going to have no evolution. And remember, we're talking about a population. We haven't said anything about a species yet, right? We're just talking about a population, gene frequency in a population. All right, so the next thing you have to have if you're not going to have evolution is, of course, you can't add new alleles, because if you have a bunch of mutations, what did you just do? You just increased genetic variation, but you've also changed the gene frequency. If you have nobody with 3 legs, but something happens and there's a radioactive dump and all of a sudden you got 100 babies born with 3 legs, right? What did you just do? You added a new gene to the population, right? So, so there it is. So you can't have mutations. So you can't have any new mutations coming in. Now, I need to say this, and you'll see in the next slide or two, you'll see it come up again. But remember, and write this down, know it for tomorrow, is that it's very difficult for Hardy-Weinberg for there to be no evolution. It's very difficult. A population over time will definitely evolve. In a short period of time, you can have Hardy-Weinberg occur, but a long period of time, Hardy-Weinberg does not. It's difficult for there to be no evolution in a population. All right. So random mating. Let's take a look at that. No evolution. So almost every population we can measure gene frequency changes in a population. It's very difficult for there not to be gene frequencies, right, changing. So that's important because you might be asked a question like that. And I can tell you that tomorrow's quiz, I'm going to keep it very straightforward, but on Friday's quiz or next week, depending on how the schedule goes, you're going to get more complicated application problems, right? After you've gotten some time to be able to manipulate this information. Now you have random mating versus sexual selection. Now sexual selection is an interesting concept. The most prominent example of sexual selection is that of a peacock, right? The males tend to have those big feathers, the tail feathers that are beautifully colored and bright and big. The females, they have tail feathers too, but they're not colored at all. You might think, well, that's not fair. Peacocks are a lot of birds actually have this. The cardinal, our red cardinals, our state bird. The males are all red, beautiful and red, right? Really bright colors. The females are more brown and kind of demure. I think they're still beautiful, but they're not bright red, right? Why? Why does that happen? It's because the females are choosing the males, and the females choose their males that have the brightest colors. So over time, what happens to the population of the males in the population? They get brighter and brighter and brighter, and they're just ultimately in the cardinal example are really red. In the example for peacocks, they're really, really brightly colored. Does that make sense? There's a really great example. There's a really great example of a bird. There's a great example of a bird. I forget the species, but what they do is, and there's one species goes and gets the color blue. Another thing gets the color red. But they make a nest. The male goes and makes this beautiful nest. And he goes, and really architecturally, really sound. And I'll show you the video tomorrow. And it's just really detailed. And then they go get every little blue thing they can find. They find blueberries and blue ribbons and blue plastic caps and blue rocks and blue, anything they can find is blue. You better not have anything blue laying around, a blue sapphire or something, because they're going to take it and move it over to their nest. Why do they, a pen. And you can see them littering the nest all the way like a little carpet of blue right to their nest, and their nest is all blue. Why do they do that? To attract the females. Because the females want the males to prove that they can, and that's an advantage for the females, right? Because the female knows that this male will provide. So that's worth her investment of energy to make babies with this male, because that male will be there to help her care for those babies. Does that make sense? And actually, birds tend to be monogamous. Birds tend to actually take care of their young. The males help take care of the young as much as the females. Not all species of birds, but most of them. So, and remember, birds are dinosaurs. So they're the dinosaurs that are left over from the great bottleneck. From the great bottleneck, right? That's the asteroid that hit the planet and killed everybody that didn't have, all the dinosaurs that didn't have feathers died, and that's why we have. That's sexual selection, because what's controlling the gene population, the gene frequencies? The females, right? The female's choice of who to have babies with is what's changing the male birds. Sorry, let me give this, yeah. That's a good question. In most birds, it doesn't. So the male gets brighter and brighter, and the female doesn't. So what you see is the females are not that bright, because the males aren't selecting the girls that are brightest. It's the girls that are selecting the boys that are brightest. So in the case of birds, the brighter birds were selected by the female. So that really tends to happen a lot in the animal kingdom. Now, let's think about a human example of this, okay? Let's assume for a minute that we are the population and the whole planet. We're the humans. Think back the beginning of humankind, right? Adam and Eve, and then a few hundred years later, this is it. This is all the humans are. We're kind of going out, we're hunting. The females are choosing. They decide, we're going to choose that for whatever reason. They're like, hey, you know what? We like the tall guys. So they're going to just choose the tall guys. So those of us that are short, we don't get chosen, right? And so we go ahead and we live our lives, but we don't have any babies. And so you only have babies with the tall men, right? So what happens to the population over time? You get tall. Does that make sense? So, and by the way, the males could be making selections too, right? So the males could be choosing to have babies with the tall females, and then that could also increase the population's height. So sexual selection can impact anything. Usually it's things that we can see. But with humans, let's leave it at that. So sexual selection, question? Mm.
When they have children, and you know how you get one from the mother bird and one from the father bird.
Uh-huh.
Why don't the colors
Neutral out?
Why don't the colors from the dad impact?
Right. So it turns out that I'm not sure where that gene is. Maybe it's on a male chromosome, right? Maybe it's sex linked. But for whatever reason, the males are the ones that turned out colorful, and not the males. But it's all right. What was the cause of it? The answer to your question is I don't know. But to say that the point is, it's not really. That's not the point of the story, right? The point of the story is the females selecting the males that are colorful impacted the frequency of the gene, right? Yes. Well, anything that's inherited is going to have to be where? Where would that mutation have to be? In a sex cell, right? So it can't be a somatic cell mutation if you're talking about passing it on. Okay, so good question. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Can you give me an example of like random mating for humans then?
Okay. Genghis Khan. Genghis Khan. We just talked about him, right? He came in, took over town, picked some women, had babies with them, moved on to the other town. That's not what happened, but basically that's what happened, right? He didn't like go around and select. He just said, okay, that's it. Come on, making babies, moving on, right? And so, and you all know people that just happen to, I don't want to talk too much about humans, but you know there are people out there that have babies with whoever, right? I mean, they're not very selective, right? So that would be an example of selective pressure. Yeah.
Okay, so like when he was going to do whatever he wanted to do, it was no type of like viruses he could have ever caught or make it go.
Oh, for sure. He probably had a bunch of diseases, but it didn't matter. He lived long enough to have a lot of babies. So the other thing you should think about is this. You ever wonder why are men so risk-taking? Why do men have big muscles? Lions, a great example is a lion. Lions the male lion's much bigger than the female. Much stronger, much more powerful, much more aggressive. The reason for that is, well, that's not really a good example because that's more than sexual selection. So there's other things involved in that. Let's leave those examples for tomorrow. Think about the male lion, and there's some story. There's a thing about the male lions that's very interesting. So there's an interesting thing about male lions and how they evolved to be so big and strong. But we'll talk about it tomorrow because it's more than sexual selection. All right, so sexual selection checked off for now. Anyways, now natural selection. Now natural selection is when you have natural selection happening, one of the alleles is favored over the alleles than the other alleles. So, what's an example? So we all humans came out of Africa, right? We all know that. We all came out of East Africa. As we moved north, further and further north, the darker your skin, the harder it was for you to make vitamin D and some other biochemical processes. And so the people that were darker skinned were not able to compete with people that were lighter skinned. And over time, what happened? The darker skinned people didn't live long enough to have babies, or maybe sexual selection. Those that were lighter skinned were chosen because they were able to deal with the lack of sunlight. Because in the north, as you know, especially in the winter, there's less and less sunlight, especially in places like northern Asia, Mongolia, Switzerland, Germany, right? Those are places with a lot of snow, not a lot of sunlight, so you can't really make some of the nutrients that we need to be able to make by exposure to sunlight. The lighter your skin, the better you're able to do those things. And let me tell you, it's more than you just think. It's more than just vitamin D. There's folic acid, and there's all kinds of other things that are involved with exposure to sunlight. So that meant that the lighter skinned individuals were favored over the darker skinned people. So over time, what happened to the gene frequency? It changed. They evolved. There was a change in the population. Darker skinned people were happened less likely or less often, and the lighter skinned people became more, their frequency of lighter skinned people became greater, right? So that's natural selection. We'll look at some examples today and tomorrow. Let's take a look at this. So with Hardy-Weinberg, it describes a population as not evolving. I said that again, not evolving. So if we take a look at this population and we say, well, okay, what if a disease came through and killed all these people here, right? So originally we had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19. We had 19. So originally we had 3, 1, 2, where's it? Where did I put the third? Somewhere in the back. I guess three darker skinned people, okay, out of 19. But now something came in and killed these guys. Some virus, maybe sunlight. Maybe there's a hole in the ozone caused these people get skin cancer and they died early. Now these guys, these older people probably would have already had babies, but let's assume they were young and they all died. You have to make sure that you understand this, that if natural selection is going to choose, it has to choose before you have babies. If you die after you have babies, it doesn't impact evolution, right? Because we're talking about gene frequency. So if these people died before they had babies, whatever their age, then we've just changed the gene frequency 3 out of 19 to 3 out of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, to 3 out of 8. And then when these people have babies with each other, right, the leftovers, they have babies with each other, what's going to happen in a dark-skinned population in the frequency in this population is going to increase. So you go from 3 to 8, it will be 4 to 8 in a couple generations, maybe in one. And then in the next generation, what's going to happen? Maybe 5 to 8, maybe 10, maybe it'll be greater. Maybe it'll be 7 out of 8. Who knows? So as you keep going, the population can change because of natural selection. Because something's selecting one over the other. All right, we're going to pause so we can listen to this. Let's look at the formula. Let's look at the Hardy-Weinberg equation that allows us to really start to think mathematically about this problem. Pay attention, because you don't want to spend every evening trying to redo quizzes. It's not something you want to do, and most of you are not going to do it. So you got to know these materials, so you have to make sure you understand. When you're looking at P, you're looking at the dominant allele. So in this case, it would be a tail fin that looks like this. This is the dominant allele. So if you're homozygous, let's talk about first. The recessive allele is known as Q, and we've gone over PQ before. And I told you that we're going to see it again, and here it is. Right, so that's right. But in P is the dominant, and lowercase q is a recessive trait. P squared is the homozygous dominant. Why? Because you have two T's, two big T's. 2PQ is the heterozygous, right? You see how you have a P and a Q, but there's two of them. See, there's one here and one here, right? 2PQ is the heterozygous. And P squared is a homozygous recessive. So when you're talking about the possibility of having two heterozygotes having children, what you need to think about is that you'd have a P squared, which is homozygous dominant. You'd have a homozygous recessive, and then you'd have two PQs, right? Together, that equals 100% of your population. Do you agree? 100% is in this case, in this formula, is represented by the number 1. So any fraction of that is not 1, right? So it's less than 1, some fraction, some decimal form. So when we're talking about predicted genotype frequencies compared to the actual frequencies, we can start to determine whether there is or is not evolution. So use traits in simple dominant recessive systems you must know the frequency of the recessive homozygotes. You must know this frequency in order to determine this. So let's go on and try to figure this out. First, let's talk about genetic drift again. So with genetic drift, you're talking about, imagine this being your population. You have 29 total spheres, and 7 of them are orange. 7 out of 29. Some random event, some bottlenecking event happens and kills a bunch randomly, kills a bunch of your people. But because you only have 29 people in your population, it's easy to get a bunch of the blues and whites dying, more blues and whites dying than oranges. And what you end up with is 6 out of 8 now orange. We used to have 7 out of 29. Now you have 6 out of 8. Now, in your next generation, what do you think is going to happen? You have a lot more what? Oranges. So as we increase our population from now on, you're going to see more and more oranges in the population, less and less blues. No whites, no greens. Do you see what evolution is? This is evolution. You see that can happen, right? Okay. Gene flow. immigration and emigration. So again, here's your population mixed of all different kinds of color spheres. Now, when you have people arriving, we call it immigration. Now you've just changed how many greens there are in the population, haven't you? You've increased the greens. When you have people leaving, emigration, in this case the oranges, 2 oranges leave, now you've decreased the oranges in the population. You've changed the gene frequency, and therefore we call it gene flow. The flowing of the genes in and out of the population. Are we clear on this? All right. Mutations. This is the population we have. Something happens. We've talked about what causes mutation. Radiation, chemicals, spontaneous. All of a sudden, you have a new allele. Boom, you just mutated the species. Or not mutated species, you just evolved the species. You have a new allele. You used to have 0 reds, now you have 1. That will spread in the population if it's advantageous, or maybe it just stays 1. Maybe that ratio stays. But the point is that now you've changed the gene frequency in the population, right? So that's evolution. You should have written some of that down, right? I know you did, but some people didn't. So again, I'm trying to emphasize what I expect to see in the notebook. I expect to see the stuff written down when I grade it. So now sexual selection. So, maybe this is initially this is what you see, but then the females start saying, you know what? I think the blues are prettiest. Blue are just the prettiest color, so we're going to go with blue. And and she happens to be a dominant female, and then all the other females start following suit. And what happens after a couple generations? You see what? Mostly blue. There's still mixed, but mostly blues. There's still a few girls that like oranges or whites or greens, but you mainly have blues left. That's sexual selection. Now natural selection. Here you have this is the population that you're starting with. Then something comes along and kills a virus, a bacteria, some tiger, some predator. A predator can eat the blues, sees the blue. Maybe, you know what? Maybe we're a bunch of rabbits. There's orange rabbits, blue rabbits, green rabbits, and white rabbits. And we're living in this like crazy, colorful forest. But then the weather changes, it starts to snow. And so everything's white. What is the predator going to see? The blues, the greens, the oranges. It's going to be hard to see what? So what happens over many, many generations is you get what? You get the white rabbits become more prevalent, higher frequency. We've just evolved the population. This is natural selection. The predator chose the ones that became colorful just changed. Now the snow stops and everything's green. You don't have that colorful anymore. You only got green. What happens to all the whites? They get eaten. So now it starts moving in the opposite direction. Does that make sense? Huh? Yeah, teeter-totter. It all depends on what? On this situation. Just like that meteor that came down. The dinosaurs ruled the planet. Everywhere you went, there were dinosaurs. A meteor hit the planet, changed everything. All the big dinosaurs died. Only the small ones with feathers survived. And we call those birds. Right? No, crocodiles are not dinosaurs. They're reptiles. They were around. They were around when the dinosaurs were, but they were still reptiles. They were not dinosaurs. The only dinosaurs still alive are birds. So in nature, populations evolve. To summarize, in nature, populations evolve. We expect that all populations evolve most of the time. There's going to be some little spots throughout the natural history where you're going to have populations not evolving. That's because your population, this population has to respond to changing environments. The example that I just gave you about the meteor hitting the Earth, killing most of the dinosaurs. That changed the planet, didn't it? Who knows what the next environmental change is going to be? Speciation. What does it mean to create a new species? A new species can arrive when populations are isolated. So when you get a new species, you mean, when we say isolated, I don't mean like the Amish have been isolated for a few hundred years. We're talking about thousands of years. You have a population that is separated from any other of its kind over thousands of years. Then you get the chance, maybe even millions. Then you have the opportunity for a population to become a new species. Of a population over time can lead to speciation. You have to have isolated populations adapt to the environment, genetic differences that start to add up. As you get mutations in that population, as you see advantages to one or the other, the changes between that group and another group become so extreme genetically that they can't have babies with anyone else that might have normally looked like them. Is that clear? That's when we define them as new species. Not that they look different, but that they won't have babies with each other. They can't have babies with each other. That's what we call a new species. A species is any creature, any group of creatures that on average mate with each other and have babies. So reproductive isolation occurs between isolated populations. So let's take a look at this. Members of different populations cannot mate successfully. Now all of a sudden you have a species. And the final step is becoming a separate species. So let's take a look at this. Scientists use lab fruit flies that are genetically similar. So these are genetically similar flies. And they developed a technique that allowed them to replace the DS2 gene in each of the lab flies with either a tropical or temperate allele. So the DS2 gene got changed either the green or the blue. The laboratory males received the tropical allele were attracted to females that received the tropical allele. Males that received the temperate allele were attracted to females that received the temperate allele.
What's temperate?
So whatever it means.
Oh.
All right. In this case, temperate means that the allele that allows them to live in changing weather patterns. Tropical means that they're living in an area that's very hot and moist. Okay? So we live in a temperate region. So weather changes, right? So when we take a look at these two differences, we just created what in this group? What did we just do? What did we just do? Initially they all just mated with each other. But now we switched the alleles. Not only the blue DS2s are only attracted to blue DS2s, the green DS2s are only attracted to green DS2s. What did we just create? A new species. Two new species from one where they used to mate. Now they won't mate with each other. These won't mate with these won't mate to these. By the way, this is sexual selection from the male's point of view, isn't it?
Yeah.
Okay. So a speciation is a rise of two or more is the rise of two or more species from one existing species. So here you have one species. We separated them in this case in the lab that created two new species. All right. Behavioral barriers can cause this. It could also be caused by courtship or mating differences. You just saw an example of these fruit flies could possibly have babies with each other if you artificially inseminated them, but they would not choose to be with each other. So they're a different species. So that could include behavioral. Geographic barriers could cause this, right? Physical barriers that divide populations. Time, temporal barriers in isolation. What does that mean? Can anybody think of an example of a time? Have you ever heard of cicadas? So cicadas, what's interesting is that cicadas come out about every 14 years. And one group, let's call it the A group of cicadas, comes out every 14 years. And they start off here, right here. And then every 14 years, they come out. Now, there's another group, B group. The B group of cicadas, genetically they're identical, but they start here on their 14-year cycle. So they only come out to mate every 14 years. They're coming out here. Do you see the difference? These guys are going, I did that backwards, I'm sorry. So these guys are going in a year later and coming out a year later. So they never see each other. You see that? These two, this group here, they're one species because they can mate with each other. They're adults at the same time. But these guys here, these cicadas, this group, B group, only sees other B group members because the A group members are asleep when the B group members are out and ready and mature enough to have sex. So this is a separation by what? Time. Not physical. They could be right next to each other in the ground. Their larvae could be right next to each other. But because this group started at a different time than this group, they're not able to mate with one another. They're completely separate species, even though realistically, if they came out at the same time, they could all have babies with one another. Yeah. Yeah, they die. They're living in the ground or they're hibernating, and when they come out, they only come out to eat and have sex. That's it. They live their whole life cycle in that summer. Mayflies do this. Mayflies live their whole life cycle in one day. Mayflies. They get eaten or they die of old age. They only live one day. Fruit flies only live regular flies only live a couple days. So every time I see someone killing a fly, I'm like, oh. It's only got two. You just took half its lifetime away. Like if you kill something that's lived 100 years, at least it's had 100 years of life. You kill you know what I'm saying? Even if you kill me now, I'm 50 years old. Maybe I live to be 80, right? I lived 50 of my years. But you kill me. That's why to me it's sad. It's sadder when a little kid dies because they didn't have a chance to live. Now here's this fruit fly gets 2 days of life, maybe 3, and this housefly gets 3 days of life, and you kill it. By the way, no, they don't. What you can do with flies that makes it easier for you not to have to kill them, plus it's messy. Just wait till sunset. Open up your windows. The flies will fly out of turn off all the lights inside. The flies will fly out of your house and fly towards the sun, because they fly towards the light. The only reason. That's why you ever notice that they die by the windows? Yeah. Yeah, that's because they're trying to get out. And lamps because of the lights. All right, so that's it. Know this stuff by tomorrow. We'll start applying these ideas over the next week.